many times have you felt like a stranger among your own friends? How many times have you smiled just to avoid disappointing others when all you wanted was silence? And what if everything you call life is, in truth, just a role you were taught to play? It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. Krishnamurti. That sentence echoes deeply in those who are awakening, not in the romantic sense of the word, but in its most uncomfortable and irreversible one, the awakening of consciousness, when something inside you breaks quietly and the world that once seemed so solid begins to feel like a grand theater. Maybe you're going through exactly that. Maybe you're losing interest in empty conversations, in forced gatherings, in the things that once kept you motivated, and the worst part, you can't explain what is happening, but you can feel that something has changed in an irreparable way. Don't worry. You are not discouraged. You are waking up. And awakening is, many times, brutal, because it doesn't bring comforting answers. It lifts the veil, exposes the artificial, and reveals how much of your life was built to meet expectations that were never yours. As Alan Watts would say, awakening is to stop mistaking the unreal for the real. What happens after this awakening? You begin to disappear, not with drama, not with announcements, but silently, like someone returning home after a long trip. You realize you can no longer take part in the game, that every interaction requires you to pretend to be someone you no longer are. This video is an invitation to the truth no one dares to say out loud. Awakening is lonely, it is uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. And if you are living this, maybe you are ready to leave everything behind. Not because you hate the world, but because for the first time you love yourself enough not to betray your own soul. Have you ever felt that you no longer belong in the places where you always were? Have you caught yourself silently drifting away from people, commitments, even from yourself, or from the version of you that you once presented to the world? Why suddenly does what once made sense now sound empty, deafening, almost false? We are shaped by what we love, but also undone by what we pretend to be. Alan Watts. This is the opening of a portal, a subtle rupture almost imperceptible to others, but overwhelmingly clear to those who live it from the inside. This is what we mean when we speak of disappearance, not a physical vanishing, loud or dramatic, but a gentle withdrawal, a silence that asks for no explanations. The body is still present, but the soul has already begun to walk away. Those who awaken disappear, and those who disappear begin to see. But pay attention, this is not about spiritual elitism. There is nothing superior or enlightened about this movement. On the contrary, it is a visceral response to the saturation of the unbearable. What once was tolerable now wounds. What once entertained now numbs. Conversations become echoes of repetition. Relationships become fields of unconscious acting. Environments become stages for a play you can no longer pretend to believe in. Imagine an actor who, in the middle of a performance, forgets his lines. He looks at the audience, sees the lights, feels the weight of the mask he has always worn, and then simply stops. Not out of contempt, but out of exhaustion. He cannot keep pretending to be the character, and the world does not know how to deal with that. This disappearance is the beginning of a deep deprogramming. It is not about running away, it is about surviving with the integrity of what has awakened. Alan Watts spoke of this when he warned that the only way to make sense of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance. But what if the dance now is another one, internal, silent, almost invisible to outside eyes? Often, the first sign of awakening is a strange aversion to performance. You wonder why you can no longer go to those meetings, join those groups, sustain certain conversations. The feeling is like wearing clothes that are too tight, trying to smile while the air no longer enters properly. This is not a wounded ego nor arrogance. It is sensitivity, a new center of gravity being born inside you. And this center no longer accepts to be fed by distractions. Socially, this movement is read as disappearing, isolating, distancing. But internally, it is a birth, a silent scream from someone who needs space to breathe with authenticity. The soul, suffocated by years of adaptations, finally refuses to be compressed to fit into the molds of a sleeping collective. Some may think, but shouldn't we stay and help others wake up? And the most honest answer might be, not while you are still trying to save yourself. Because trying to save the world before saving yourself is like running to put out fires with your own clothes in flames. This disappearance is sacred. It is when you begin to see yourself without social filters, and sometimes that is only possible when the noise stops, when you step out of the roles, the ideal child, the exemplary professional, the perfect partner, and begin to meet the one who existed before all those titles. Perhaps what scares those around you the most is not your physical absence, but the absence of the version of you they once knew, the one that was moldable, understandable, predictable. When you disappear, they no longer know where to find you. And if we're honest, you are also trying to locate yourself. But in that absence, something is built, something truer, something that doesn't need to be validated, explained, or posted. As Rumi, the Sufi poet, said, "When the ego is silent, the soul can finally speak. The soul does not shout, it does not impose, it only whispers and leaves when it is not heard." That is the invitation of disappearance, to hear what was once muted, to feel what was once denied, to recognize that there is a deeper existence that can no longer be postponed, and there is no way to do that in the middle of the crowd. That is why, when someone awakens, the first choice is not to act, it is to disappear. Not out of weakness, but because this silence is the beginning of reconstruction, and every reconstruction begins with demolition. Demolish the character, demolish the inherited truths, demolish the commitments to unconsciousness, and then, in the dark of absence, listen to the question that echoes with force. If I am not what others expect, then who am I? That is the beginning. And that is exactly why disappearance is so necessary. There is a point of no return, and if you made it this far, you have probably already crossed it. Once consciousness awakens, something breaks for good, like a bridge collapsing behind you, making any attempt to return to the old normal impossible. The world is still there, the people are still there, the same voices, the same social rituals, the same commitments, but something inside you refuses to continue. And that is frightening, not because the new is unknown, but because the old no longer has structure. It's like biting into a plastic fruit. The shape is perfect, but the taste is absence. The truth is that awakening is like walking out of a movie mid-scene. The light of the real world burns your eyes. You notice that everyone around you is still glued to the screen, crying, cheering, emotionally invested in something that you now know is not real, and trying to fit back in after that is like trying to sleep after discovering the house is on fire. You might lie down, but you can't rest anymore. This is why those who awaken don't go back, not because they don't want to, but because they no longer can. Consciousness has no switch-off button, and this is where many people collapse internally, because the system taught you to define yourself by what you do, the group you belong to, the achievements you display. But now you can see that all of it was built on a character. And that character no longer represents you. You can no longer be that professional who fakes passion for soulless metrics. You can no longer take part in meetings where everyone fights for recognition as if life depends on it. You can no longer sustain friendships built on sarcasm, distractions, and emotional absence. All of it sounds fake. And this perception is not just rational, it is physical. The body reacts, the chest tightens, sleep disappears, exhaustion settles in. The soul begins to fall ill for not being where it belongs. And the cruelest part, almost no one understands what is happening to you. You're acting weird. You've changed. You've pulled away. You disappeared from social media. You never show up anymore. But how do you explain that the reason isn't resentment, contempt, or arrogance? How do you explain that in truth you are rebuilding yourself in silence? How do you tell someone that you are trying to learn how to live in a way that doesn't murder your soul every day? You can't. And that is why many choose silence. It is not isolation. It is protection. It is not disdain. It is self-respect. Because returning to old cycles would be like betraying a sacred secret, like pretending you never saw what you saw. And what did you see? You saw how fragile everything is, how people hide their fear behind loud certainties, how society is held up by a collective performance in which everyone pretends to know what they're doing while repeating inherited patterns without ever questioning if any of it actually makes sense. And most of all, you saw yourself. You saw the you that was always there but was pushed aside in the name of acceptance. You saw your vulnerability, your truth, your essence, and you can no longer ignore that. Alan Watts used to say that the menu is not the meal, But how many of us spend an entire lifetime eating the menu, satisfied with pretty names, pretty theories, pretty pictures, while the real experience of life slips through our fingers? This awakening threw you onto the bare ground of existence, without script, without makeup, without filters, and now you are learning to walk again, this time on the legs of consciousness. It is painful, it is lonely, but it is real. Yes, you may feel tempted to go back, to reopen your social media, to force social encounters, to smile again with those same old smiles, but deep down you know it would be a lie, and once the soul discovers the taste of truth, it begins to reject illusion, even if illusion offers comfort, applause, and belonging. This point of no return is not a sentence, it is a rite of passage. You are no longer who you were taught to be, you are beginning to remember who you really are. And that is why there is no going back. After the soul awakens, silence stops being absence and becomes shelter. At first it may feel frightening. The mind, addicted to stimuli, noise, and movement, doesn't know what to do when everything slows down. Used to running from itself through obligations, social media, distractions, it begins to collapse when there is nothing left outside to fill the emptiness inside. But it is exactly there, in that apparent void, that something sacred begins to emerge. Silence, when welcomed, becomes a mirror, and in it you start to see everything you were trying to avoid: old fears, unresolved wounds, pains that were ignored for far too long. And even though the first reaction is resistance, the truth is that these wounds do not surface to hurt you, they rise to finally be healed. Healing in silence is not dramatic, it is not spectacular. It happens slowly, almost imperceptible to external eyes. It is a reunion with parts of yourself that were forgotten, suppressed, denied so you could fit into the world. But now, with the world falling behind, you can finally begin to belong to yourself. It is in this space of stillness that you listen to yourself for the first time, truly. Not the voice that learned to please, to compete, or to justify itself, but the clean voice, without filters, the one that has always been there, but was muffled by the noise of hurry and survival. And when you hear that voice, you discover something essential. You are not broken. You are coming home. This is not about isolation, but about integrity. You stop forcing yourself into interactions that require versions of you that no longer exist. You stop translating your depth into superficiality just to maintain bonds. You stop explaining yourself to those still imprisoned in noise, and that may look like coldness, but it is actually an act of love. Love for yourself, for your mental health, for your new truth. Society will say you are pulling away, but the truth is you are finally drawing closer. To yourself, silence is the fertile ground where you begin to plant a new way of existing. It shows you that you no longer need constant validation, that your worth is not in likes, instant replies, or others' opinions. In silence you see yourself bare, and that nakedness is liberating. In this process, something subtle begins to transform. Your pain starts to make sense. The voids that once terrified you now invite contemplation. Loneliness becomes solitude, restlessness becomes introspection. And what once was noise is now space. Space to feel, to think, to cry, to laugh alone, to meditate, to question. All of this is part of the cleansing. You realize that you were exhausted not by life itself, but by carrying so many layers that were never yours. And when those layers begin to fall, relief appears, lightness appears, a new kind of silence appears, not the one that oppresses, but the one that sustains. A silence that receives you, that embraces you, that says, you can rest now. You don't have to pretend anymore, and so, in that silence, you begin to rebuild yourself, brick by brick, not to become who you were, but to become what you never had permission to be, something more authentic, calmer, more whole, because it is in silence that you heal, and it is from healing that reality is born. After disappearing, after crossing the desert of silence, something in you changes forever. It is not a performative change. It is not something you post or declare. It is something internal, almost invisible to those who look from the outside, but radically transforming on the inside. You return, but not as before. You return with a different gaze. You return without needing to prove anything. You return not to fit in, but to inhabit your place. A place that has nothing to do with status, recognition, or the old craving for acceptance. It has to do with presence, with authenticity, with truth. You look at the world and it is still the same. People continue to repeat the same patterns, the same arguments, the same games as always. But you are no longer bound to it. You watch, you listen, but you no longer get entangled. It is as if you now live on the edge between two worlds, the old one where everyone is still asleep, and the new one where you begin to breathe more lightly. And in that threshold you become a threshold dweller, an inhabitant of the borderlands, someone who does not deny the world, but also does not let themselves be swallowed by it. Alan Watts said that the truly awakened person is the one who no longer needs the illusion, but can move through it without getting lost. You can go to work, attend a meeting, meet friends, but now something is different. You are no longer acting, you are whole. This does not mean perfection, it means coherence. You may even return to the same places, but not in the same way. Because now you know that to truly be anywhere, you must first be with yourself. And that presence, that inner completeness, is what changes everything. You speak less, but with more depth. You laugh more, but more lightly. You act less by impulse, more by intuition. You become unintentionally a mirror. And those still trapped in the game begin to feel uneasy with your silence, your calm, your refusal to engage in drama. But there are also those who sense something different in you, a cleaner frequency, a more honest energy. And these are the ones who are beginning to awaken, and perhaps, without noticing, you become a lighthouse for them. Only now, unlike before, you have no desire to be anyone's master. You don't want to be a savior, a leader, a guru. You only want to live in truth. And if that inspires someone, good. But you do not push, you do not convince, you do not evangelize. This is the greatest sign that you return different. The real now lives inside you. And you no longer need a stage to exist. You can be in the city or in the countryside, surrounded by people or in absolute silence. Your center is within. This is the point where performance ends, where authentic existence begins. And even if the world keeps trying to drag you back into unconsciousness, you are no longer carried away. Because now you know the taste of truth. And once someone has tasted the real, they can no longer pretend. Awakening is not an achievement. It is a consequence. It does not happen suddenly with fireworks or mystical illuminations. It happens in silence, in discomfort, in the refusal to keep living on autopilot. It is when the soul says, not anymore. Not anymore pretending, not anymore shrinking to fit, not anymore accepting what wounds, what lies, what disconnects you from yourself. And then the disappearance begins. But contrary to what many think, disappearing is not dying. It is returning to oneself. It is when you stop existing as a character and begin to live as presence. You abandon the performance, the role, the script, and allow yourself to be real, even if that costs the world's misunderstanding. Alan Watts reminds us that the only way to make sense of change is to plunge into it. And that is exactly what you do. Even without understanding everything, even without knowing what will come next, you plunge, you vanish for a while, you become silent, and in the middle of that silence, something blooms that no longer depends on external acceptance. Your truth. And when that truth awakens, it does not bow. It does not adapt. It does not beg to be welcomed. It simply is. And that is what the world needs. Whole people who chose consciousness even when the price was high. People who never returned to the theater, because they understood that what looked like an ending was only the beginning. I want to thank you, and truly for staying until the end, because if you made it this far, it means something in you has already started to change, and I know how confusing, lonely, and at the same time liberating that can be. I say this not as someone who read about it, but as someone who went through the process. I disappeared too. There was a time when everything around me was noise, and inside me there was only silence. I kept going to the same places, but it was as if I had become invisible. Conversations no longer reached me, the meetings felt staged, and the smile I wore was more to avoid alarming others than an expression of joy. It was during that period that I discovered something invaluable. Sometimes disappearing from the outer world is the only way to reappear in the inner one, and it was exactly in that space of absence that I started writing scripts like this one, because I realized there were more people feeling the same, and that maybe no one had ever put it into words. So if this video made sense to you, if it touched something inside you, know that you are not alone, you are not crazy, weak, or lost. You are finding your way home. And I thank you for allowing me to walk with you through this part of the journey. Now then, can we drop the mask of seriousness for just a second? If this video shook something inside you, broke you down a little, or made you want to quit everything and go meditate in the woods, then hit the like button, because not even the algorithm understands that this kind of video exists. Subscribe to the channel before you disappear for good and never return to the internet. I promise we'll respect your silence between videos. And comment down below, what was the moment in the video that turned you inside out? Or just write, I came back different. We'll know exactly what it means. As for the video showing up on the screen right now, well, those two on the side, I can't tell you what's in them, but I can tell you that if you click, you might find something you didn't even know you were looking for. Maybe an answer, or maybe an even better question.